Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Coalition for Marriage YouTube channel. Now, just in case you are joining us for the first time, it's a privilege to have you here. We are the UK's largest pro-marriage organisation. We're quite unique because we support and promote this notion of one man, one woman marriage. And that certainly isn't to say that other things don't take place in a civil society, in a liberal democracy. Of course they do, and they're all around us. But actually, we think that one man, one woman marriage is special. We don't just think it. We believe that all the evidence, the body of evidence, international evidence over time and over cultures shows how one man, one woman marriage is best for adults. It's certainly best for children, and it's great for society. And nothing else comes even close. And speaking about the evidence, that's a key factor in our approach to these subjects, of course, and it's a real privilege to have somebody with us today, an economist who spends his time focusing on the evidence, an industrial economist, Professor David Peyton. David, would you like to say hello?
Hello, it's a pleasure to be with you, Tony.
Now, David, I know that you've got a couple of different areas of expertise, which are very interesting for many of our listeners, I'm sure. One is the economics of cricket, which sadly we probably won't get onto today. Who knows, we might have time. Another is the economics of Brexit, again, something we probably won't touch. But then the economics of teenage pregnancy and sex education, which is key to debates around family structure and what we teach children, because the way we talk to kids in schools influences perhaps their behaviour. Can I ask, first of all, what got you into this kind of study?
Well, I've been involved in the pro-life movement for quite a number of years, and I was also an economist and trained in industrial economics, and it came something of a surprise to see that actually there's a lot of work by economists looking at issues of abortion, birth control, sex, marriage, and there's a long tradition of this going back many years, looking at the economics of the family. And that was quite an eye-opener for me, because one of the things I'm lucky enough to be able to do as a researcher at a university, you can choose the area you look at and things that you're interested in, and that spark things off, like the economics of cricket. We're allowed to sort of pursue. And of course, economists, we're not allowed to have morals or rights and wrongs. But I think we do have a role in looking more at the data and the evidence.
Now, you mentioned statistics, and obviously the benefit of the work that you do is that it is objective, it's based on evidence, and it's based on stats, and it's based on outcomes. They have a massive advantage in America because they seem to collect stats on everything, and they have done for many, many years in a way that we don't. So it's very clear in the US, for example, to look at outcomes for children who grow up with a biological mum and dad or who don't. And from a population base, the evidence seems to be pretty clear that the outcomes are better for those who do. That's not to say that, there are some situations where, children from broken homes do absolutely fine, and children from growing up with their biological parents turn out off the rails. But on a population base, it seems to make sense from the statistics. I wonder, have you done any work around things like fatherlessness, things like the impact of broken marriages, etc.?
I think that it's quite helpful from a statistical point of view is very different state regulation. So it allows you sort of to tease out cause and effect a bit easier. If one state's introduced a particular regulation, what's the impact on an outcome? You're certainly right that the evidence is very clear that children in a stable relationship have far better outcomes on average. Not in every individual case, of course. We have to be a little bit careful because it's always hard to tease out cause and effect, because you might argue that children in a stable marriage, yes, objectively the descriptive stats say they have much better outcomes, but would that be the case anyway? Because are people from perhaps more likely to get married if they're in a different wealthier background, for example, or they're more religious, they were going to stay together anyway, and they happen to get married. So we've got to be a bit careful. And it's not easy at all to tease out some of those effects, and there's some studies do that better than others. I think we can be fairly clear that though that on an outcome level, that things like teenage pregnancy, emotional development, psychological problems, and so on are certainly worse from children from a broken background or without that traditional family structure. That's absolutely clear, and the data is very, very strong on that.
Correlation, yeah, I mean, that's always an ongoing argument, isn't it? Correlation versus cause. Quite an interesting one. You're absolutely right. There was a piece of research published by the Relationship Foundation in 2018. I don't think they've updated it since then, which indicated that the cost of marital breakdowns in the UK to the taxpayer was in the region of £51 billion a year, which, to put it in context, is around about our national defence budget spend. So a lot of money, and that's in things like housing costs, additional social care needs, additional educational requirements as a result of children's trauma, criminal justice system implications, etc., as a result of marital breakup. So massive cost in terms of the economic impact of marital breakup. And I'm just wondering, from an economics professor perspective, what would your view on those kind of figures be?
Yeah, there's no doubt it's a very significant impact. We can argue about the precise level of the data, but if we think about the fundamental purpose from a society's point of view of marriage, there's all sorts of reasons, in terms of love and relationships and so on. But from a society's point of view, the key purpose is that link with children, that you're attaching children to their father and mother. And in a way, that marriage, people talk about it as the foundational unit of society. And what that means is essentially it means that we can get on with our lives without the state having to intervene, because childbearing is very disruptive. Somebody can't necessarily work or be economically productive while they're all the time they're having children, and somebody needs to look after the children. It's very time intensive, especially during the early years. And having the traditional family structure is a way of organizing that. So we just get on with things, and the state doesn't have to intervene and say, actually, you are the father of this child over there and this child over there, and you've got to have your responsibility and enforce it. You sort of, when it works, and we know it doesn't always work, and sometimes perhaps for nobody's fault it doesn't work, but when it works, that family unit does serve that a really important economic purpose, and it is genuinely the building block of society. So when marriages break down, then, which may be very sad and maybe nobody's fault, but yes, a consequence is that there are economic implications, and there are economic implications for the state. So we know that divorce is associated with much higher rates of poverty. It's not a surprise when you've got one household living together, whether or not you've got one parent or both parents working, you're only maintaining one household. When the family splits up, you've got two households to support. So by definition, it's a bit more expensive and harder. And of course, it hits people on lower incomes much harder. So yet that then means the state has much more of a role in terms of benefits and helping out. You're right, the court costs, when you have much more unstable family structures, you then have a much more complicated situation of assigning parental rights and duties. Who has to do what? The state has to get involved much more. And yet it is very, very costly. So I've seen the study, the £51 billion. You can go through the numbers and argue. I think we can say, yes, it's a very big number associated with family breakup, and it's a serious public policy issue. So going back to, what we do about it, we can't force people always to stay together. Terrible things happen, and we're a function of culture as well. So when, the state can't necessarily change how people see marriage, whether they see it as an important thing. But I think there is still an appetite for marriage in the population. But what the state can do, I think, is at the margins provide ways of supporting that structure and recognizing that there is a social purpose of traditional marriage that benefits society as a whole. So recognizing that in the tax system much more than we do, I think, would be very important. I think one of the retrograde steps is the diminishing importance of child benefit. So previously, child benefit was a non-means tested benefit, and it applied to as many children as you had. With child benefit, it goes direct to usually the mother, but to the parents, and it then gives them the choice of how, especially in those early years when things are very difficult and they might be harder, if they're in a situation where both parents work, or one works part-time and one works full-time, it can still help them out. If they're in a situation where one parent wants to give up work for a few years to help look after the children, it makes it much more possible. Whereas childcare is much more targeted. That, of course, is really helpful if you know you're going out to work and you need the childcare, but it doesn't help in giving you the choice as an option. So I'm not saying the state shouldn't have any support for childcare, but at the margin, for me, it's a real shame that we've moved away from child benefit, which helps give parents the choice of bringing up their children as they see fit.
And in terms of why the government doesn't follow processes and procedures and policies that it can clearly see have the biggest benefit for society. I mean, one thing you might add to your list of things you could do there is teach the benefits of marriage in school, in sex ed classes, the statistical benefit of saving sex for marriage, the likelihood of marriages lasting longer the fewer sexual partners you have before marriage is statistically quite clear, especially from US evidence. Why aren't we teaching that? Why do we seem to be doing everything but supporting marriage?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I am hesitant about saying governments should be telling schools what to do anyway. I think actually we shouldn't have a law mandating schools to do sex education. Actually, we should give more flexibility for schools to work with parents to decide what's appropriate in their, for their particular set of children. But yeah, as a principle, if governments are providing schemes and recommendations, absolutely, the importance of marriage should be there. Also, the importance of delaying sexual activity. You can go down a lot worries about morality and it's not for the government to impose a particular morality. Well, fine, but also it's important that children have the right information. So understanding that it's not just having sex when you are ready is all you need to know. As long as you use a condom and consent, which is a message straight away, it's almost a moral message that's given out. I think that the government recommendations should certainly add to that and say, yeah, all the evidence suggests that if you delay sexual activity at least until you're older, ideally in a committed relationship, there are better outcomes. What you do with that information in the end is up to you. The government can't control that, but making sure those messages get over. And the same with marriage, that that there is a link between this public commitment to staying together and relationships being more stable and outcomes for children is an important message for children to understand early on. But as I said, I'll be a little bit hesitant about governments telling schools what they have to do. I'd rather they move back and tell schools less what they have to do.
But the point is that these aren't necessarily moral issues. They're socio-economic, politically beneficial issues. Society does better, the economy does better, criminal justice system is reduced. The whole thing improves with these types of behaviours. So it's not a moral issue. It's just a common sense, let's make society better issue.
Yeah, so every child should grow up understanding why marriage has always been a building block of society for many years and why it's been seen as so important. I think we do miss out sometimes on history. Something changes, they didn't know anything 500 years ago, and of course good and bad things happened 500 years ago, but sometimes the ideas that persist for a long time persist for a good reason, not always, but understanding at least why it was seen as so important and why people say actually marriage is that building block of society, and it plays an economic, a social, a psychological role in maintaining society in a way that frees up resources for the government to use where they really are needed. I think that's important that children grow up knowing that.
I think society generally still ascribes to the view that teenage pregnancies aren't necessarily a good thing. So as far as I understand it, the point of sexual education from a government perspective is to teach kids to be safe in their sexual activity, but we seem to have moved to a position where we seem to be ever increasing the amount and the depth and the breadth of the type of sexual education we're giving kids in order to educate them better, to help them make better decisions. But as far as I understand your review of the evidence, that's not actually leading to much in the way of a reduction in teenage pregnancies and sexually transmitted diseases. Is that a summary?
That's a fair assessment, and it's not just my assessment of the evidence. So when you look at the broad range of evidence on sex education, on the impact of sex education on teenage pregnancies, on STIs, on outcomes, there's hundreds of papers, of course. You can always find one paper that finds one finding, another that finds the other. If you look at the systematic reviews, so for example, the Cochrane systematic reviews, which are seen as a gold standard of evidence on randomized controlled trial type approaches, where they look at what happens when you have sex education in one area and not in another, and you compare outcomes. The conclusion of their studies is basically that there's no strong evidence that school-based sex education has any impact on sexual health outcomes, on teenage pregnancies, STIs, and so on. I had a paper last year looking at laws, sex education mandates. So what happens in countries that have introduced mandates saying you have to have sex education in schools, either at primary school or secondary school, and also variations like when you're allowed to have parents are allowed to opt out. And our conclusion was, when you look across the developed world, there's no evidence that these mandates lead to a reduction in teenage pregnancies. And that shouldn't be a surprise, given the other evidence that sex education in itself seems to be remarkably ineffective in influencing these outcomes. So I think, yeah, the evidence suggests that sex education in schools isn't the way of achieving, or there's not evidence that it has good outcomes in terms of lower teenage pregnancies, better sexual health, if you like. That doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't have sex education in schools. There may well be a role for it, and you may want, for schools to help parents in that role of delivering education to children about sexuality. And there's certain things we want them to know at different ages, and biological facts, of course. And it may well be that schools have a role in that. One of the problems, I think, is that an impression has been given to parents and indeed to schools that we have to go down a particular line of sex education. It has to start really early, be very comprehensive, cover everything, and be done in such a systematic way. Otherwise, children will be hit, will have adverse consequences. That isn't the case, or at least there's no evidence that that's the case.
So what about, I'm not sure the right to withdraw for parents withdrawing their children from education that they don't want them to be, because one of the big key topics is, look, if you tell children about things they don't know about, they're going to go away and give it a go, because that's what kids do. You're going to you educate them about things they otherwise wouldn't have come across, maybe. And some parents might think, yeah, I don't want my kids to know about different types of sex and different types of, sex, same-sex, attracted and heterosexual, different forms and oral and all that sort of stuff. I just don't want my young child to be exposed to that stuff. So they might withdraw them from those lessons. What about countries, and indeed Wales is an example, where the parental right of withdrawal has been taken away. So you can't take your child out. The state now says they have to be educated. Is there any evidence around whether that's a good or a bad thing?
Yeah, so just to be clear, the used to be an absolute right in England for parents to withdraw their children. That's now qualified right. You have the right to ask head teacher for your child to be withdrawn up to the age of 15, whereas it used to be at any age. But it is, in the end, it's up to the head teacher. So we've got a much more limited right for parents. Now, there's all sorts of things going on there. I think that's a very retrograde step, but any school that's worth its salt, I think, should still say, if a parent judges this type of education isn't right for their child, we will accede to their request. And I think that should be a policy of every school, that they say, well, we will allow parents to withdraw their child at any age. So, there's good and bad schools. I think that would be good practice. One of the advantages of doing that, what the right of parental opt-out does, not many parents take up that right, but it does encourage schools to think a little bit more about what is really appropriate. So it's not just what happens. It means that schools think, well, hang on, if I do this, will parents be happy with it? Which is what schools should be thinking about any form of education. They're in loco parentis. It's still parents who are primarily responsible for children. And by doing that, it provides, I think, a bit of a limit for schools. And it also allows schools who are perhaps a bit unsure, they're given a scheme of work and think, well, this is a bit explicit, I'm not sure about this. And some expert advisor tells them, oh no, everybody's doing it, you should present this to your primary school age children. But knowing how parents are going to react, I think it helps head teachers and teachers to think, well, actually, no, we know our parents are going to be unsure about this. We'll just be a bit more cautious and perhaps delay it or do it in a different form or not use that particular scheme. So there is an important role for it. In terms of the evidence, there's general evidence that when parents are involved in these decisions, you tend to get good outcomes. But also there's an interesting paper finding that rates of teen suicide go down when you introduce these laws. And that's a very complicated link in terms of early sexual activity and mental health and so on. And there's all sorts of influences. But I think it's some of these findings are very interesting and should give us some reassurance. Involving parents is not a negative thing. Parents make mistakes. We all, I'm a parent. We all make mistakes and get things wrong. But of course, so do governments, and so do teachers, and so do schools, even when they're trying to do the right thing. And actually saying, well, when it comes to children at heart, our default will be that we'll trust parents. Of course, we know there can be really serious exceptions, abuse and so on, but as a rule, we'll trust parents to have the best interests of their children at heart. It tends to lead to good outcomes. And in a paper we had looking at sex education mandates, we found that although sex education mandates, if anything, when schools are forced to do sex education, if anything, teenage pregnancies seem to go up. When you have an exception and you allow parents to opt their children out, that sort of limits the damage. It makes it less, you have less of an increase in teenage pregnancy rates. So yeah, the parental opt-out law is the right thing to do. It's right for parents, but it also does seem to lead to good outcomes as well.
Mm. So you talk about, you mentioned there quite interestingly that when sex ed is mandated, pregnancies seem to go up, which kind of seems pretty logical, to be honest with you. You teach kids how to do it and they'll just go and do it. But I'm wondering, is there any evidence to indicate, beyond the pure numbers, to indicate harm per se associated with more sex ed rather than less sex ed?
Yeah, that's much harder to pin down. And I think a fair view of the evidence would be that in general, most sex education has very limited impact. Now, I'm not an expert in terms of the psychology and the influence on emotional and spiritual and development of young people. So I wouldn't want to rule out and say, well, there's no harms from sex education. And I think also very early and explicit sex education, what's going on in primary schools is relatively new, and I think a little bit of an experiment. And I think most people's instinct is to be very cautious about introducing these ideas at too young an age, because they feel as a parent it may disturb the sort of natural innocence of children, and the danger is it sexualizes them too early. So I think there's good reasons for being cautious about that. The one area I would say where there is evidence of harm is which is something that's sold as part of sex education, that schools are encouraged to provide access to family planning and to abortion, to sexual health services as part of their sex education programs. And they're encouraged to do this even below the age of consent, so for minors, and they're encouraged to do this confidentially. So children are told, well, we don't have to tell your parents if you don't want us to. Now, the evidence on there, I think, is much worse, because there's quite systematic evidence that sort of approach has normalized sexual activity amongst young people, but has also prevented or perpetuated child sex exploitation. So there's a number of serious case reviews where people have looked at, well, what's happened with some of these grooming gangs, or not even gangs sometimes, but cases where young people have been under serious sexual assault. And very often we find that they're being provided with sexual health services at schools, or via the school, through the school nurse directly, or schools facilitating that to other agencies. And that's an opportunity for intervening and stopping the abuse happen. But people all too often say, well, it's consensual.
Now, let me because our supporters may not realise, I think you wrote a foreword to a book by Norman Wells, the late great Norman Wells, one of our trustees, in fact, Unprotected. And I think you wrote the foreword to that book, didn't you?
That's right.
And that has several really good examples of failed cases in it, which still, even since that book being written, haven't been addressed properly, and there aren't safeguards put into place. And in fact, we've got even further. I wonder if you'd like to comment on the perception of consent and how that's being pushed in schools as the only thing that's important. So there's no moral right or wrong about sex. There's just, well, if you're old enough to consent and you're happy with it, that's all that matters.
Yeah, I think it's a very worrying aspect of sex education. It seems to be systematic in the schemes that governments in the UK at least promote. So the idea is that, when is it okay to start having sex? And the response, there may be some mention of the law. I think it's illegal when you're under 16. But in the end, they'll say, well, nobody can tell you when you should have sex. It's when you are ready. When you are ready. As long as you are making that decision, you consent. So consent is seen as being both a necessary but also a sufficient condition for saying sex is okay. Now that phrase, when you are ready, if you think about that, for, say an immature 13-year-old who's going out with a boyfriend for as long as 4 weeks and they really, really love each other. And the boyfriend says, well, all our other friends are having, they're having sex. Who knows if that's really true, of course, or not. And so then you're in a position, so, well, I'm not sure, am I ready? Yes, I think I am. He says he really loves me and everyone else is doing it. And the school says, it's okay to do it when you are ready. No one else can tell you. And I really feel ready. I want to do it. So that message has gone out is really, really, really dangerous because, of course, there's no age limit attached to that message, or it's no sense that, are you in a stable relationship where if you were to get pregnant, you would have, be able to look after your children? Are you of an age where it's, apart from anything else, is it legal? You get these really mixed messages, even in schools, where they're prepared to facilitate underage sexual activity by providing condoms directly or the morning after pill, or facilitating that, or even putting young girls on the pill, even though it's below the age of consent, without parents knowing. I mean, it's quite mind-blowing actually when you think it through. And we have, so it's obviously damaging in itself in terms of normalizing underage sexual activity, but you also have this very sad link to sexual abuse. You might argue that 13-year-old involves abuse by definition, but even worse cases where you've got a 13-year-old and a much older person, and they go to the school nurse or the sexual health agency and they say, oh, my boyfriend's 15. Who knows if that's the case? And so there's no, it doesn't trigger an investigation, whereas actually any under 16-year-old looking for, to be put on the pill or sexual health services like that, I think should automatically trigger a safeguarding concern.
Yeah. And I think you highlight in other places, other references, the Scottish RSHP scheme for 11 to 15-year-olds, the Brooks Traffic Light Guide, and other sorts of materials that seems to be used in schools all around the UK quite regularly, which kind of normalizes an awful lot of sexual behaviour for teens and even preteens, and just the dangers around if we say the only thing that matters is consent. Exactly like you say, it introduces people to things and makes them think, well, it's fine if I do this.
Yeah, and it's really, really worrying. And the Brook Traffic Light guidance is a particularly bad example. That we don't know what they've done with it because they now hide it behind the paywalls. We don't know if they've tweaked it, but the version that's still in use in lots of areas of the country has what they call green, amber, and red sexual behaviours. One of their green sexual behaviours, even for under 16-year-olds, is sexual activity. Green behaviour they see as something that's positive and something that you should give positive feedback for. And they're talking about sexual activity for 13-year-olds in some cases as being part of this green behaviour, as long as it's consensual. It's absolutely incredible as part of this. This is a safeguarding tool. And yet the idea of a 13-year-old having sexual activity does not raise any safeguarding concerns. I think it's utterly wrong. And at one point, the Brooks safeguarding tool was being recommended as a government resource, and it's certainly recommended by lots of local governments still around the country. So we have this situation where we have a sort of, it's quite systematic. It's not one-off problems and cases of bad practice. You're always going to get some people who do things well and some people who do things badly. No, this is systematic. This is part of government recommended schemes that do seem to normalise underage sexual activity and encourage schools to present material to young people that does that. So, one of the things that's being discussed at the moment in the schools bill is whether there should be an amendment to force schools to provide parents with access to all materials that are used in sex education. And for me, this is a really basic requirement. A good school will do this anyway. If a parent goes in and says, well, I'm not sure about the sexual activity, the sexual education, can you show me the resources you use? A good school will say yes. But all too often we hear stories of schools being a bit reticent and saying, well, no, it's it's from another provider, but it's copyright, we can't show you, or we don't know where it is. Straight away, that should give you a signal that there's not something quite right here. Remember, education isn't a shared responsibility between schools and parents. It's a parent's responsibility. And schools,
or even a lot of parents say to me, so I've spoken to literally thousands of parents, And a lot of people will say to me, either they don't ask or they're too afraid to ask because they don't want to be kind of labelled as a problem parent, if you like. So they don't ask in the first place, let alone asking and then, as you say, being told, well, it's copyright or it's not something we can show you. But you would encourage people to ask.
That's right. And it's hard for parents. You don't want to be seen as that awkward parent. I mean, I think, if a school is willing to share the material, usually there's one or two parents who are a little bit bolder and will look and then, word and get around. But actually, I think schools should go further than that. And actually, schools should tell parents how they can access material. They should be. So I was a governor at a school and had responsibility for sex education, and our policy said exactly that. If you want to see the material we use, this is how you do it. And we try to make it as easy as possible. And of course, that gives the right signal because, you're showing, well, we haven't got anything to hide. Why would we want to do something that you weren't happy with as parents? And it's the same with the parental opt-out. Schools should make it really easy for parents to opt out. If you make it difficult, that makes parents think, okay, is there something going wrong here I should be worried about? And maybe there is. Whereas if you give parents the option, you build up this trust. But of course, that's got to go along with it that you do also do the right thing and don't provide material that's too explicit or clearly age inappropriate. But at a minimum, you need to be transparent, honest, open. Parents, even when you think you're doing things in the right way, some parents may say, well, okay, I can see what you're doing, but I don't think that's quite right for my child. They children are different. They develop at different ages. So if it's okay, I'd rather they didn't participate in that session. And that should be seen as absolutely normal and nothing controversial.
So where do we go from here? I mean, it's almost like a lot of people are saying, well, the pendulum's bound to swing at some point. Who knows if it will or how far or, in what way. But in terms of, our individual approach, I get you're an economist. You're not necessarily a political scientist or a sociologist. But your advice from your experience and your research, what should we do? Those of us who think that there are benefits in promoting marriage, the more conventional form of family, which seems to be getting squashed out of the mainstream media and everything else that's going on, what should we do?
We can't stop doing what we're doing in terms of, of course, lobbying MPs and government for sensible policies. We're not in an environment where, a very helpful environment for that, but there are good politicians there who are willing to listen and focusing on the evidence on what's important for society. It's the right way to go. I think also, though, we're in a situation now where parents in particular have to start to take control. They have to stand up and say, well, some of the things that are going on in schools are really, are these the things you want your children to see and to understand? And I think parents need to be much more vocal in saying, well, going in and actually saying, no, I do want to see what you are teaching my children. Are you having this drag time, story time that's in the news a lot at the moment? Is this happening in our school? What is the rationale for it? And if you're not happy with it, making it clear. We've seen in America lots of success of parents now standing up for education boards and having more of an influence on policy. And I think parents in the UK can do the same, going for governing bodies, being a parent governor or a foundation governor for religious schools, getting involved, being active, not being irresponsible, not being that difficult parent, but just being reasonable about what they can expect and making it clear to schools that parents are responsible for education and schools are there to help parents do that job and to act in loco parentis. I don't think we can be in a situation anymore where we put our heads in the sand, and trust that everyone's going to do things the right way and they've got our best interests at heart. I think most teachers and head teachers probably do want to do the right thing, but there's this overwhelming tsunami of material and culture which hitting people, and they don't always respond. I think as head teachers and teachers don't always respond as they should. Sometimes because they're just not aware of the evidence and don't really think through the implications of what's happening. So it's not always because as I said, they're trying to do the right thing, but parents have to say, no, that's not right for my children. I think that's the most important thing. That's sort of mind shift you've got to be. No, you're not anymore. You're the sort of awkward parent if you do this. It should be front and center. You've got an interest. You're at least a partner in what the schools are doing, and you should make sure that you make full use of that.
Excellent advice. And the same old argument that civil society evolves from the ground up. I think I've mentioned on several different interviews, there was a Comres anonymous survey of MPs published in October 2018, and of over half of those who responded said that they felt too fearful of expressing their true opinion on some of these cultural issues, and too fearful, therefore, you would think, to vote with their conscience as well. And you think, well, if our MPs feel that, how much more so for very vulnerable head teachers and teachers who are under the cosh and are being pressurised by certain lobby groups. And so, you know, we are the people we've been waiting for. You know, you're absolutely right. We can't rely on the politicians. We can't rely on others. We've got to stand up as parents and just make our voices heard, as you say, in a gentle, reasonable, but absolutely firm way. Professor David Peyton, what a privilege to talk to you. I hope your work goes from strength to strength. Any other subject areas you're looking at? Where's your work going from here?
I'm just got a paper recently published on looking at the impact of assisted suicide laws in America on suicide rates, which, you know, it's slightly different topic, but related. And I'm also working on a study looking at the impact of mandatory COVID vaccination on care workers and whether that had any impact in reducing care home deaths. So another not non-controversial area of work.
Yeah, you like the non-controversial areas, don't you? Yeah. Well, listen, once those are published, and we'll keep an eye on you and perhaps have you back and talk about some of your future work. Thanks for what you're doing. Keep up the great work, and thank you very much for your time today.
My pleasure.